Namaste and a very Shubh Ganesh Chaturthi to all of you. In the course of my discussion today, of our session today, you might hear the sound of Shankhanad and Manglarti. So let's hope that gives us, more inspiration to, go on with this and reach our goals in life. So quickly to taking up from what Rahul told you all about me. Kalidasa, the great poet, had once said that for people of character, when faced with a dilemma, whether a certain action or deed is good or bad, their own inner voice is the final arbiter. So what makes people act or behave in a certain way? How do people, as individuals and as groups, take decisions that are at times rational, irrational, good and bad, as individuals and as collectives, be it as a nation, across the nations? So it was this imperfection of human behavior that got me riveted to the study of human systems. And that's how I did my undergrad in history from Dedi Shri Ram College, followed by masters in political science from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and a PhD again in political science from National University of Singapore. But this was the time that there was this mobile revolution that was going on that had taken the world by storm. So I was keen to understand the relation of the impact that technology had on people. And so that's how, especially human interactions. And so that's how I spent more than a decade in the R&D divisions of Motorola, Nokia, and Samsung. And I was recently a visiting faculty at IIIT Bangalore. And at present, I'm a member of Indian History Awareness and Research, a nonprofit based in Houston. So let's get started. Today, I'm going to be sharing my field experiences with you. So here's the thing. The thing is, no researcher is ever going to tell you about biased studies, let alone erroneous conclusions being drawn from such studies. But when they say that there are lies, bigger lies, and statistical data, you could say the same for qualitative studies as well. In fact, erroneous conclusions from biased studies drive our policy and administrative initiatives, and they also influence the country's political, historical, social narratives. So I think it's time that we took a step back and rebuilt our narratives by rebuilding studies, so to speak. But a first thing to do all this is to really understand what are the research methods that are followed in these studies. So like I said earlier, I'm going to share from some of my experiences on the field. So this is me with a Madhubani artist, and it was a very interesting experience a session that I had with her, where she told me how the Madhubani art was almost a dying form of art with her in her family, and that she was probably one of the last to take it forward. But through a series of chance meetings with people, that dying art flourished again. And she has been able to take her art to both national and international forums. So you get these kinds of very interesting experiences, interactions with people when you undertake field immersions. This is going to be the structure of my study today. I will begin with the brief historical context of qualitative studies in India, followed by the rationale and merit of undertaking such a method. Then we will explore some of the problems with modified ethnographic research, qualitative studies, field studies, right from research design, creating hypotheses, unethical practices undertaken, especially while interviewing respondents, all the way to data analysis. And then we will look at some of the ways, strategies by which we can alleviate some of these problems. This was in Bangalore. It was a few days before the famous Peanut Festival, which is called the Kadlekai Parishe. And so it was a lot of fun, lot of interesting things happening around me. The sights and sounds were amazing. So I thought I'll share that, give you a feel of the kind of field immersive studies that I have undertaken. Right. So to begin with the historical context, the thing is that the study of Indian social structure, culture, religion, and polity owes its roots to ethnographic traditions seeped in qualitative methods right from the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, there was a strong emphasis on collecting data in terms of two things, race and physical anthropology. And you have studies around this time that were undertaken for the purpose of census. So it's not surprising that census data at this time became synonymous with caste data. And it's not surprising, again, that the British officials at this time began to publish a lot of literature and books on India's so-called India's caste structure. Most of the field immersions around this time, just to quickly tell you about what happened around in that phase of early 20th, late 19th century sort of studies, most of the engagements, field immersions at that time were exclusively on the tribal populations of northeastern, central, and southern India. They concerned themselves mostly with the tribal populations. So it's also another thing that I want to call your attention to is that most of these studies in the early phases were commissioned by the British government and they were undertaken by the British officials themselves. But this also paved the way for ethnographers later on who had a definite missionary purpose. Now, what happened is by the mid 20th century, qualitative studies of India's social structure, especially sociological and anthropological studies, began to follow two major institutionalized ideas, that of caste and village. Who hasn't heard this being repeated several times in so many of these sociological, anthropological studies? Caste and village. Now, the Orientalists' perception of caste was from the European concept, especially post-Portuguese, that was called the casta. And that European concept was used to give a generalized explanation for Varna and Jati. The Varna and Jati system and its order of India was given a generalized explanation from a European context. And one of the distinctive qualitative researchers studying the social structures around this time, they started, the few of them who started and the others picked up, was that not only did they, superimpose their own experience of social discrimination back in their own countries, in their own European countries, they also conflated India's social orders of Varna and Jati and other forms of social categorization to make it seem that it was a pan-Indian form of Brahminical system of exploitation throughout the country, the pan-Indian narrative, so to speak. Now what has happened is, of late, this kind of perception, this kind of thought has been challenged by a lot of Indologists. Now, again, now coming back to the present, from the time that India attained its independence, you had Indian researchers and Indian students undertaking the study of anthropological and culturological studies in India. And but this is the funny part. They did not give up their Western theoretical constructs. They still continue to follow these Western theoretical constructs. But you do have some of the interesting studies that you get to hear on and off, especially in the rural hinterlands, which speaks of the farmer suicides. You might have read a lot, heard a lot of the studies done on farmer suicides. So what happened is, one of these studies that spoke of farmer suicides linked it to the inept administrative structure and the administrative system, which is a very in-depth study, and I would say really appreciate such studies. But when media, when other people, and especially those researchers themselves, take up from such studies to make claims that Indian women, Indian rural women who do not call their husbands by their first name are empowered, are really empowered in political gender, social and political gender terms. They are empowered. And what it means is, by default, those Indian rural women who do not refer to their husbands or the other menfolk by their first name are unempowered. So when you have this kind of ludicrous claims coming out from such studies, then you start wondering, what sort of lens do these people take when they study India? The Western theoretical construct? Shouldn't they be using their own voices, their own lens to understand the Indian phenomenon? And that also brings me to the question of ethics that researchers follow when they go to the field to collect data. I'm going to begin by why qualitative studies in the first place. That is, what are the advantages of qualitative studies? The first thing is, yes, of course, it's a good enough bet, because the thing is, a sizable portion of social science research today occupies itself with the study of people, their systems of interacting with each other, and the kind of outcomes that they generate for each other. So when you are studying this particular phenomenon, you need study methods that are conducive for researchers to intermingle with respondents, right? And so field immersions that we undertake usually pick up some form of modified ethnographic inquiry, typically open-ended questions, guided interviews, silent observations, and so forth, which is conducive for gathering data in the in the context of the users. We call these contextually proximate data and contextual data, which is very rich, which is very vivid, and is said to be closer to the truth, in the sense it's closer to the context of the people, of the users. Now, the thing is, if, for instance, we wanted to understand how people are navigating their identities in the digital platform, how they are asserting it, how they are concealing it, in what ways are they navigating their digital identities, you can get a lot of dense information by following this kind of study with these research methods research tools that I mentioned earlier. Now, the other thing I wanted to point out at this stage is, you do have a lot of statistical data that tells you how certain mobile brands or how certain political parties have got support from different demographic sections across the country. But those are just statistical figures. It doesn't tell you why. For instance, it doesn't tell you about people's opinions or perceptions, needs, aspirations, moral values, all these things that go into their taking decisions, right? And you want to know the why of these decisions. So that is when qualitative data helps, because not everything that counts can be counted. To quickly tell you a few more things about qualitative studies, they're also extremely useful for field immersions for exploratory studies, especially where you're trying to find a trend that is coming from the field and you don't have a predetermined set of research plans. And you can actually have a case study and build it through incremental narratives which are coming from the field. Now, so that is really, really rich data that you do not want to lose out on. So that is a very interesting advantage of taking up qualitative research methods. Now, this is a double-edged sword where qualitative studies are concerned. The thing is, it allows the researchers to engage with the respondents, with the people in the field over an extended period of time. So it allows the researcher to generate trust, right? To gather trust and confidence. And at the same time, there's this appreciation for the shared experiences of the researcher and the researched. So I call this a double-edged sword, and I'll come to it in a bit. It's a very nuanced and a very rich tool for study, the qualitative research methods. Very nuanced, very rich. At the same time, it is a craft that is usually picked up from an expert in the in these methods, and he or she teaches it to his or her students again. So you have something like a mentor-mentee model that gets built up. And here is where I'm going to take you to the problems of qualitative study. Like I mentioned, the mentor-mentee model of knowledge transfer. So what happens is, on the face of it, it is great because you're learning from someone who's an expert, who's a scholar in this method itself. But what happens is, in this kind of arrangement, there is some form of adherence to specific theoretical constructs or biases, especially ideological bias, theoretical bias, prejudices that are upheld and transferred from the mentor to the mentee. And what happens is, on the morrow, when the student himself or herself becomes a recognized researcher, he or she will be further propagating the same theoretical perspectives, the same biases, the same prejudices in the body of knowledge and literature that gets shared. And the media is just there to pick it up and further disseminate it to more and more people. So do you see how it is, what is happening in the background, and how this whole bias thing is not just a one-off or a standalone, one person, one data, one study kind of a thing. It just gets built up. So now it's not surprising that the other problem with qualitative studies is that it's highly dependent on the skills of the researcher. As someone said, researchers are the research instruments for qualitative studies. So qualitative methods become, constrained, become influenced by researcher vagaries, by researcher-induced vagaries. So here's the thing, the skills of qualitative researchers drive the research design to a large extent. There was a study that needed to be conducted in certain locations, and the locations were picked up based on the language known to the researchers, based on who they had interacted with in the past. Was it in the rural areas, be it in the peri-urban, semi-urban areas, or even the urban spaces? They needed, there was this thing about who they had already met with before and knew beforehand. And only those locations were taken up. And only those user segments were chosen, were selected for the final study. And then after all that was done, there's nothing wrong in having practical considerations driving a study. But when you try to make it seem that this is actually an academic exercise and this is really why we undertook the study, you try to retrofit the research design with a rationale, right? And then what happened is that the data that was coming from users was filtered at a very basic level. It was filtered from specific locations to corroborate certain hypotheses that the researchers already had from the past. So that's the problem with retrofitted research design. Now, the other thing is bias. I've been talking a lot about bias. So there could be different kinds of biases: theoretical, ideological, which is obvious. Then specifically, you could have racial bias, ethnic, gender bias, many more biases. But what is needed is for the researcher or the scholar to make those biases apparent to the audience or to the readers at the outset. So at least the readers and the audience know where this data is coming from and who is coming up with this data. Just to give you a quick example again. So this is in the foreword of a book by Purnima Mankekar, which is called National Text and Gendered Lives. So if you go through what she says, my return to India was shaped not by a nostalgic search for roots or origins, but by the complexity of doing ethnographic research in the cultural context that shaped my own subjectivity. And as a post-colonial Indian woman socialized into these discourses of Indian womanhood that I critique, my own subjectivity is inextricably entangled with the study. So see, she's proclaiming, declaring what her subjectivity is, where she's coming from, and what kind of biases she might carry. So take that into consideration and read the next para, where she describes a certain event that was televised, and she's putting in attributes to what she is seeing. She's interpreting this, she's putting up these adjectives and all these words as attributes. So you have Hindu right-wing groups trying to destroy the Babri Mosque. You have the faces of a number of middle-class Hindu women, combination, expression of rage, excitement, bordering on frenzied rapture. Now you can kind of relate that to what she has said about her subjectivity and where she has come from. So that makes it very transparent and easier for the reader to read and make sense of what is being told. Now, the other problem, unfortunately, is not so forthright, because that problem comes from the funders. And I brought this up because many of the studies that I have been involved in are mostly funder studies funded by international donors, very, very well-known international donors. So the thing about international donors is that they have their predetermined mandates that they come up with. So there was this study that the donor had done in the past in certain other parts of the world, and what they needed was opportunity areas to isolate and invest for future programs. And the exploratory study, which was to be conducted in India, was not really an exploratory study. It was more like a corroboration exercise, like just checking the checkpoints. You just need to check it. So that's all it was about. So this is what the funder told us. So they knew that which opportunity areas not only to invest in, but also they had told us which specific sites to go to. And not just the sites, also what to pick from there. See what they're saying. We have completed Africa and parts of Asia. We got communitarian tension. Now we need religious, economic, and caste tension. Get those codes. And they also told us, you'll get it in the northern Indian locations, bundle that up with personal and community identity sort of thing, right? So they are actually dictating what exactly should be said, what exactly should be picked up from the field. So the thing is, they had prerequisites for us. The funders, they had prior requirements because of the communitarian tension that they had found in their previous studies from other countries. And they wanted that to be further corroborated. So they told us very clearly, take up caste exploitation in rural areas, and then there'll be other forms of social hierarchy and relations that you will find in these rural areas. So get that and bundle it up with personal identity and communal identity issues. Bas nikalo, caste data kisi tarah nikalo. With all this that is happening, right from wanting to cherry pick data to actually taking away certain aspects of what's coming from the data as though it didn't exist. What is happening is, rather than formally construct theoretical validity, they're trying to forcibly fit a theoretical validity into what they have found. And this reminds me of a Greek story where a giant called Procrustes binds his hostages to an iron bed, and if their feet extend out of the bed, he chops it off. So we have the modern day Procrustes, where for the sake of generating theoretical validity, they will chop off data that will not corroborate with their hypothetical constructs to make it seem that this is a valid theory. So this is the same thing that happened in some of the earlier interviews that I was part of in the field immersion, where certain data points were ignored because they did not. Now I'm just going to talk about deviant data, is where there are certain elements of data that start coming out, which are either different from or they contradict the emerging patterns and explanations during data analysis. So if there is something that was told about picking up communitarian tension, but you have data, a sizable amount of data that negates it, that says that that was not such a big issue. There were other issues such as informal networks among people being more important than just caste relations and communitarian and community relations, that it was also important to leverage on one's social networks. So that kind of data gets, pushed aside, and because it's a deviant data. And then the other wonderful thing is where divergent data gets created. Okay, as though it's not enough that you are muting the naturally deviant cases that are coming up, you want to introduce a divergent point to it, where everybody said, for instance, that they did not have a problem in certain aspects of communication in their village, and they're getting certain provisions from their ration shops or something like that. Now that is not a problem, but they wanted to bring the divergent data saying, nahi, problem hai, there is a problem, so let us focus on that. So that is where they create divergent data. Okay, now let's see how that divergent data gets created when you start manipulating interviews, obviously. So not only do you start introducing value loaded leading hypothetical questions into your interviews, you also start manipulating the responses from the people on the field to create that divergent data, to create just that set of data points that will help you validate your hypothetical construct and say it's now a well-established theory, right? This is a senior researcher who was introducing what we call as hypothetical questions. Just take a look at the flow of these questions, all right? Where the senior researcher has asked this lady, have you and other women participated in the protest against the government in your state? She says no. And then the senior researcher says, would you have joined it had your religious head asked for it? Respondent insists and says no. Then further, have you ever felt threatened by members of the majority community in your area? She says never. And this is the height, I feel, where the senior researcher has now introduced religious conflict, religious tension wantonly into this scenario, where he asks, okay, how do you think you may feel threatened by them in the future? Now that's a total hypothetical sort of a question. Hypothetical questions are very important. They serve well in surveys, but it compromises data when the objective is to gather direct experiences from people rather than their views and feelings on counterfactual, hypothetical sort of events. And then you encase those hypothetical answers that they gave you, the kind of probably sort of answers that they gave you into direct experiences of the people in a particular phenomenon or as part of a particular event. You foist it as their direct experience, you have a problem. Now, if you look at this slide in front of you, can you imagine the bigger issue out here if it were a non-Indian researcher asking these questions? If it was, say, an American or a British, anyone, a non-Indian in the field with rural people asking this sort of aggressive questioning and hypothetical at that. It's downright unethical. Well, I leave it to you. Don't you see it as extremely unethical? And this is the point I wanted to bring in, where you have non-Indian researchers coming to the field and causing more issues. Let me go back to this. There's this thing about qualitative studies where we call it as interpretive description. This interpretive description plays a very critical role because it critical description of the researchers. Okay, so this is where the subjectivity and bias of researchers will really impact the research design, right from sampling, data gathering, and analysis of descriptive studies. So in this, there is a difference in what is told to the researcher by the respondent by way of description and how the researcher interprets this descriptive response that is given to him or her by the respondent. And this interpretive description of the researcher is completely dependent on the subjectivity and bias, right from theoretical background, ideological base, and above all, the sensitivities of a researcher. So typically what is done is you have a certain theory or a hypothetical construct that you want further validation for, and you get data that's coming from the field, and then you process that data. You don't just put it as standalone sort of data to the other researchers or other people in the academic field. You need to process and condense that data as either causal or consequential. That is, it is either leading to a phenomenon or it's leading from a phenomenon. And this is the way you need to project it to the academic audience. Now, like they say, there is many a slip between the cup and the lip. Can you see what sort of slips can happen from a researcher's, from a respondent's description of his or her experience in a phenomenon to the way it is interpreted and described by the researcher in turn. Right? There's a huge gap. There's a huge gap here. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring here, mention here, is when you have not just the researcher's bias, but even the field assistant's bias that makes a bigger mess of things. So let me take you there. Here is the field researcher. So there's this researcher who is close to the end of the session, and he's saying, is she all right? Is the respondent all right with continuing the session for a little while? And the field interpreter says that, asks her, can you stay on? We have a few more things to discuss and interview. And the respondent honestly says that I have to go back. She lives across the river and she had to travel back and forth for work every day. So she says, I have to go back. My boat leaves shortly and I must hurry. So researcher, obviously from the body language of the respondent, understood that she needs to go back. So he asks, she says that she must leave. And look at the wonderful answer the field interpreter has given. Yes, her husband does not want her to be delayed. I don't know where this came from. So this person had his own set of biases that he wanted corroboration for, and he just had to get it there somehow or the other. All I can say is, you have multiple levels of interpretive description happening of the data. There is the researcher, there is the field researcher, there is the translator in the field if you don't know the local language. And can you see how data gets diluted at every stage? And can you imagine the kind of the study outcome that's going to come, the conclusions, which can be called maybe partially valid, if not completely invalid. So here's the other thing. You have, and I call this a double-edged sword. This thing about continued interactions with the respondent, where you can have a long term of engagement, interacting with the user in the field. But the problem is, it also generates what's called hierarchies, a hierarchical relationship, where to some extent it is based on obedience. If some of you are familiar with Stanley Milgram's experiment of obedience, then you'll be able to quickly get this, where the researcher can demand obedience from the respondents. So, and can you imagine the situation if you have non-Indian researchers on the field? So here's the thing. In my experience, I've had a lot of non-Indian researchers also joining in the field. And this further accentuates this hierarchy that we have in the field immersions. So the initial reactions of novelty, of hesitation by respondents are replaced over a period of time by feelings of friendship, an excess desire to please, and the inability to refuse. And this is quickly leveraged by both Indian and non-Indian researchers to elicit as much response as possible from the respondents. So this is like the game that is played in the back end, and you won't even know this is happening when the research report finally reaches you, right? So that was the other thing of continued hierarchies being followed. So the other thing I wanted to bring in here is where you have field researchers going on and off from the field. You have non-Indian researchers coming in and joining the Indian researchers on the field. And at some point of time, the Indian researchers need to shift from one location to the other. And so if you can imagine this kind of dialogue between the non-Indian researchers and the respondents, you can only imagine, you can only see how much worse this sort of a hierarchical relationship gets. It can only get worse. Now I come to this thing about after study, after data gathering, what happens. What is done in grounded theory studies, and I'm an adherent to, I strongly believe in grounded studies, whereby the theory gets built in from data coming from the field. So if you look at the white, those blurred white strips of paper are essentially user quotes, which we analyze in terms of co-occurrence. What is the similarity between them? How can we understand the similarity of different user quotes? And then we give it a first level theme, which are those yellow sticky notes. Those first level themes are as descriptive as possible, because you need to give the reason why you're putting it together, how it makes sense, why is there a co-occurrence between those user codes, and those are the first levels. And those get abstracted to the second level and further abstracted where it becomes less descriptive to the third level. This is the typical procedure of affinity analysis, which we grounded study researchers typically follow. And now we come to the after data analysis, after data gathering, what happens? Okay, so this again, I'm going to tell you from my experience, is when we had funders involved in the study who were funding the study, especially international donors, and they wanted, the insights from the field. First, they wanted findings from the fields on a weekly basis. Then they said that quickly changed to delivering insights from the field on a weekly basis. So what happened is raw findings had to be quickly modified into research insights and takeaways. And while, and in this process, unverified claims and preliminary interviews were also put forth as insights. So those things about there being some sort of tension in caste, tensions in terms of religious tensions and those kinds of things, even without further verifying whether it held true for the interviews that followed, within a week, we had hardly done some 10, 12 interviews that went across as insights and inferences, because that's what the funders wanted anyway. And that went on, that went out as inference. So once it goes out as an insight and inference, seldom will a researcher or a team of researchers retract that and say, no, we were mistaken. That is not what happened. They will want to push it forth, even in the second stage, even in the third stage. So that's one. Then the other thing is coding. Imagine if this were not a grounded theory exercise. Imagine if this were a regular hypothetical deductive sort of theory approach that you have, and you already have certain theoretical paradigms of, say, around privacy, around caste issues, around religious issues, and you put those as your theme. You already have that as a theme. Now, what will you do? You're only going to put in user codes or fabricate, and in the worst case scenario, you're going to fabricate such user codes to fill in those, those first level themes. So what happens is, as they say, you should prepare the child for the road and not the road for the child. So here what is happening is you're preparing the data for the researchers' theories to sit tight. So coming back to the problems after data analysis is this thing about macro recommendations. So the problem is in inductive studies, especially case studies, is the problem of generalization or extrapolation. And that gets underscored by, like I said, case studies. But the thing is, case studies are very important because they allow you to find the similarities and differences or the patterns between similarly placed communities or similarly placed people across communities. So that generates a wealth of data. But the problem comes in when, with funder bias, with funder pressure, with pressure from senior academic, interests in mind. They want quick macro level recommendations from these micro level inferences. So what are individual experiences are then put forth as non-individual outcomes and projected as truisms. Okay, so that's another problem. And funders and donors themselves contribute to skewed outcomes and conclusions because of their predetermined mandates, as I said. Now we come to the fun part, which is called the reflexivity section. If you pick up a regular qualitative report or a research, there should be something called the reflexivity section. Reflexivity is nothing but putting forth one's biases and one's prejudices, one's antecedents, backgrounds, whatever else that that they think can bias a study in a certain direction. They're supposed to put that in what's called the reflexivity section. How is it possible for anyone to lay their biases, to lay their prejudices out in the open for anyone else to kind of judge it? So it becomes an exercise in futility. A senior researcher had said, let the reflexivity section not be an admission of blunders, rather let it be something that the stakeholders can learn as improvisations or takeaways. So from my experience, reflexivity as a section was just used to justify research methods and not even bother to look at the challenges that were not met with, but only to focus on the minor little challenges that they were able to kind of overcome. So it was primarily justifying research methods. And if that is the case, then a reflexivity section is at best a retrofitted commentary than an actual retrospection. So even there, the reflexivity section, where you would think that here is a chance where the researcher, where the the theoretician might probably be honest enough about the study, the qualitative researcher might be honest enough about the study to come out with what has happened. That doesn't happen, even in this case. Now we have seen all the problems that there are. So how can we rectify it? What are the ways in which we can alleviate these problems? So first and foremost, we need what's called collaboration that will lead to better accountability and transparency. But first things first, you need to, as a researcher if you're a qualitative researcher, you need to discard that pre-identified coding mechanism that you have been kind of drilled with right from your study days, from your education. Have a theory, then get data to corroborate your hypothetical constructs. That is the only way you can convince your readers. I think you need to move away from that sort of a mindset and give up what's called pre-identified coding mechanism, because that is not going to generate truth, only more lies. So in this way, I feel grounded theory approach is much better. Adopt, if possible, as far as possible, a grounded theory approach, because with that, you let the user quotes the actual context of the people out there to come up with theories bottom up. That will generate theories. You don't have to impose it top down. Let it come from bottom up. And the second thing that should happen is you need a large team so that biases can be called out on a regular basis. So here's the thing. If you have a large team, then the pre-identified coding mechanisms can be discarded in favor of something else. For instance, someone else might find a new observation or a new nuance coming from the field, from the data that's been generated, and they can bring everyone's attention to it. And at the same time, if there is any likelihood of a bias getting generated by a set of scholars, then these co-researchers, as part of a large team, can call forth bias, right, on a rolling basis, as and when it happens. Then they can bring it to the attention of the team, right? Now, the other thing is what I have called as what is followed many times is triangulation. The rationale is we need to practice convergent validation of our data. We need something that can validate our theories. So they say that the best thing to do is follow what's called triangulation. So with that, the shortcomings of, say, the qualitative analysis can be surmounted by putting in quantifiable results, or having someone from the team undertake quantifiable research, which will generate independent measures. So the weakness of one method will be compensated by advantages of another, and then you will have independent measures which will not have the same bias in that case, mostly to a large extent. And the other way to mitigate it, and I have been repeating it many times in whatever workshop or student-teacher interaction that I've had, is that you need a multidisciplinary team. So what happens is, in the presence of a multidisciplinary team, the issues of subjectivity, credibility of data can be addressed with a team that participates in data interpretation as well. So that contributes to the field data getting open to a larger panel of experts and practitioners. And it will not be a black box that nobody else can make sense of anyway. And if this is undertaken by a team, that is a fair way of judging whether or not the findings themselves and the process of the study have been credible and true. And the other important thing is allows internal validity to be tested and given to a larger panel of experts, where the relationship between research questions and data sources are checked. Is there a proper valid relation between the two in the first place? And to make sure that each of them, each of these multidisciplinary professionals will be able to undertake this study, or at least validate this study in disciplines that they are familiar with in their own research approaches, at the same time calling out biases. So that's why the need for a multidisciplinary team is extremely essential. And not just a team, you also need a multidisciplinary approach from the time of schooling, from education itself, to have a multidisciplinary outlook. And last but not the least is what I have said about taking the study back to the users, as in engage in something like a feedback session with respondents. In a way, this will also make the data more credible, and the veracity of data can be established. And to a large extent, also remember that slip between data that is generated, that is as in described by the respondents, and how it is interpreted by the researcher, to a large extent, that gap can also be bridged. And most importantly, we will not be relegating respondents, especially in qualitative studies where we deal with human subjects. We will not be relegating them to an object, right? We'll also be empowering them if we can go back to them after the study and engage in a discussion to see whether what we have interpreted and what they said were congruent or not. So I think this is a lot of effort that is needed on the part of qualitative researchers, but I think it's worthwhile because not just researchers, if we are out there in search of the truth may elude us, but this is the least I think we can do in our individual and collective pursuits as academics and as an informed set of citizens. Thank you.
Very nice and sparkling talk, ma'am. And this really is surprises, because this kind of problem is not only in the social things, but this problem is also in the science also. And we can see if something is from the ancient literature is quoted for the science, people start criticizing without any scientific evidence. And the biggest problem I saw even after giving the scientific evidences, like the present time the corona treatment was advised by Patanjali, although the ashwagandha is well known, studied in the scientific literature, and then those journals papers are available, so people are not ready to agree. So I think there is some policy paralysis from the government side, that they are slow. What do you think about this?
Certainly, I have shared my experiences as a qualitative researcher, but this is a problem that has definitely hit sciences as well. I mean, it's been there for a while. It's just that now, if you have a set of people who are more informed, then they can question the researchers in the first place. Ask them, how did you come across these kinds of numbers? Where are you generating these from? How is it happening? Right? The fact is that there is no accountability So if there is no accountability, enough and more of such studies, be it in the case of the COVID numbers that have rapidly moved from one spectrum to the other, that keep changing from recovery rates being high to suddenly recovery rates being higher than high, and something else happening along those lines. So if you have a set of people right from and this is not just the researchers. I think people who are the target audience of these researchers need to question them, should not be taking these things on face value. I think that's the main thing. So I agree with you. It's there in sciences. It's also there in not just quality. Like I said, it's not just qualitative statistical data that you have these problems. And anything that requires a set of researchers, a set of experts to sit together and build and do something pretty much cuts out the rest of the people who are not part of it, who are not privy to it. And so you can generate data as you want. And who is there to question you unless you as a set of respondents, as audience, as readers, challenge it.
Thank you, Saritaji. It is a wonderful, unbiased study. I have done some few studies earlier, and I confirm whatever you have said. There is a lot of bias, not only in the people who are actually conducting the interviews. Many of these are also donor-driven. And especially I will specifically talk about this report writing. Even however wonderfully the interviews are conducted, when they are ultimately taken for analysis, the bias of the guys who are doing the analysis makes a lot of difference. Not only that, if I may talk of my one specific experience, which will only back up your whatever you have said. I had an opportunity for doing a perception of corruption index for Transparency International about 2 decades back. That was the first one to be done in this country. We gathered data from all over the country. I myself had traveled to a number of states, Assam, Bengal, Bihar, everywhere. And when the data arrived, we found that the perception insofar as the judiciary was found to be more corrupt than any other, police or education or something. I had made that final remarks, and I had to go out for a week or so because of some family, somebody getting indisposed. When I came back, I found that the judiciary had been pushed down by 2 or 3 steps, and police had been upgraded to the most corrupt department. So when I asked the chairman, he said, "Sir, what can we do?" And those are 2 decades back. Nobody dared to say that judiciary was corrupt. So finally, when the report was placed, we said police is the most corrupt. Judiciary, yes, corrupt, but not so as corrupt as the police. So this is how reviews and reporting are I will not say manipulated. Sometimes you're compelled to do it. The NGO who is presenting this data has to survive. It's a fact of life. They are donor driven, and whatever you have said is absolutely right. I agree, madam. Bye.
So, and I have like similar interests in terms of where computer science and related work goes. So, bulk of the presentation was on biases of the researcher, but then from the field that I'm in from within the academy, I see 2 disturbing trends, and I just wanted to know your comment on that. One is there seems to be a trend of predetermined conclusions. So there is a conclusion, and then you reverse engineer analysis based on that. And this, ironically, was recently exposed in some of the journals in gender studies in US. But then it seems to be, I don't think that particular exposure did much to the field, and it's still pretty dominant that you have predetermined conclusion, and then papers get published. Once a paper gets published, it gets a legitimacy, it makes its way into the classrooms through syllabus, becomes a required reading in many cases, and then it keeps spiraling down that way. So, and then the parallel I want to draw here is from, let's say, there used to be a time when sugar industry or industry that used to sell sugar products used to fund research that will show that sugar is not bad for you. Same was case for fossil fuel industries. And there was a lot of uproar against certain organizations are funding research, which eventually benefits them. So the conclusions are biased. But there is no such call for accountability at large in public when ideologically you are invested in it, and so your conclusions are in that direction. So that was one. Second is relatively more benign, which is a lot of research these days in qualitative, especially that use qualitative methods. The language seems to have gotten more and more complicated for anyone to understand.
Right.
I remember reading CHI, which is one of the conferences where you have like computer science and qualitative research gets published. Those papers used to be relatively easy to read. And now there are these words which I can't find in dictionary. They're so complicated. Like I've read sentences like the heteronormativity or performativity of X, Y, and Z. So it's like, and sometimes I personally feel that the language is made intentionally exclusive for, so that it remains within a set of researchers who have control on how to influence policies. So that's the second part. And I just wanted to know your opinion on these two.
Sure. So I'll address your second part first, because that's something that has been hitting me right in the face so many times. So let me add to the words that you had put there. How about confutation of converged realisms, right? So you have weird words like these coming in from nowhere to completely make the people who are reading your research just to silence them. As somebody asked earlier, right? You have these kinds of reports coming in, getting generated, and then nobody seems to ask questions about it. That's because they won't know where to begin, and it's become such a coterie of exclusive people that nobody knows how and where to start challenging them. And if you don't understand, how will you start challenging them in the first place? And what you said about classrooms, ideological studies, I mean thrusting of ideologies and theoretical perspectives coming into the classrooms, and then it gets carried forward as a legacy. Again, that reminds me of what you had mentioned earlier, this thing about academic people who, I think you and I have had that discussion once. So this thing is, it's a huge rot that has set in, and I started following some people's work in this, more like they are academics themselves, but they have also tried to be whistleblowers in terms of trying to make the system as honest, as credible as possible. And so here's the interesting thing. To be an academic, you need to understand why the academics do it in the first place. And my due respects, my apologies to all the academics who have joined this call. I'm an academic myself, and I think we just need to be more honest and in what we are doing. So to begin with, to be an academic of any value, you need to have a track record of publications and papers in esteemed journals. And that is interesting because it's supposed to be a double-blind review, and you start sending papers to your reviewer. Actually, you already know who it is. If you're an old hand in the game, you already know who is your reviewer. So you start tweaking your paper a little bit more and a little bit more, and then it starts going back and forth. And what gets accepted, funnily enough, is when the paper begins to recreate what the comments that the reviewers have given, but make it crazier and weirder, as in taken more and more extreme positions. More and more extreme your position is in an ideology, in a certain theoretical construct that you follow, the greater acceptance you get. So you need your novelty comes from the fact that you're making it crazier, where all the words which you said, we can put that in, or you make it more extreme in its position. Right? And once that acceptance happens, your paper has got the acceptance essentially of the larger academic audience. And not just that, the media picks it from that. Media makes it big, because media, journalists at the end of the day need some sort of credible, researchable work that has gone in the background. So they will want the academics or the researchers to kind of give them that credibility to what they are saying. That credibility is fed off by the researchers, and the media makes it big. So the whole mess just becomes even bigger. And I'll give you another instance of the theories and the ideologies. and how they become distorted and extremely biased. So, for instance, if you make fun of masculinity and the male persona in your paper, it gets acceptance and credibility, especially for those who hold the beacon for gender studies. Okay, if you ridicule the white male and say in the Indian context the Brahminical / Hindu culture, then that gets immediate resonance in the department of say race and culture studies in some of the well-known universities. And in a way, gender parity is fine as long as it's against men, right? Just to give you an example. And a caste system is fine as long as it's against a certain, the upper caste or something like that. So what has happened is whichever paper of so-called research that it has done points in the direction of a conflict or dispute or polarization, that immediately gets acceptance among these academics, and be it they modernists, postmodernists, Marxists, Marxists, or what have you. And all these theories have to get fitted into theory of polarization and generate a certain narrative of what is called competitive victimhood. So you say that, it's not just exploitation of poor, but it's also exploitation of women who belong to the poor category. It's also exploitation of gender, sexuality, color, any other attribute of victimhood that you can create. And that's how it happens in social sciences. And I agree with you that they lay the cart before the horse. You build your theories, not just theories, you actually put them as conclusions that this has actually happened. Now let us make it even more strong by putting in data points and converging the research design around it. So that's what I wanted to say.
So I have a comment and a question here. With these type of studies increasingly going out, which actually are sort of predetermined in some ways, the entire narrative out there, at least in universities and among popular discourse, is already sort of comparative victimhood, like you sort of mentioned. There is constant victim card playing. So for example, the spaces for an alternative view, say in the Black Lives Matter, it's completely been taken away. Okay, as a person who's working in a corporate environment or running a business, which is sort of global, it's very hard to put out any alternative viewpoint. You'll be, sacrificed and thrown out, and all of that. And with more and more studies continuing to be funded, with likes of George Soros and all of these, what do you do? What do you do at all to break this almost like a mafia?
So the thing is, it comes down to money at the end of the day. So it's not just a question of narratives that are getting played, but it's also a question of who holds the purse, who is funding your study. So, I mean, I really think that it's high time that we kind of became a little independent in the kind of studies that we undertake. And if people in different ways, in whatever capacity they have, question what is being said, it may be a small movement right now. It's probably not much, but that's how it should gain popularity when you try to reach it to a large mass. Today you have social media. I'm sure if you were to bring it out to more and more people, somewhere someone will be able to join in, will find some echo in what you're saying, and they will be able to understand from where you're coming from. Because if you are again going to play the same, let me play safe, which means you're actually, in the case of, say, social sciences, it is this whole Western paradigm that has completely hijacked all our narratives. Whatever you see, be it India's social structure, be it India's cultural narrative, religious narrative, everything is from a Western perspective. So I think it's high time that India Indians need to start speaking for themselves and as themselves. Otherwise, what is happening is Indian anthropologists, sociologists, or even in the corporate environment, the kind of studies that they want to bring out is again from a Western perspective. Essentially, it's the West talking to itself. On the face of it, it's an Indian who is doing it, but it's the West talking to itself. So what you need is independent initiatives which are taken up by people who are like-minded, say like you or like me or anyone else, and put it out to the social media, because I think social media is a huge tool we have with us today, and this is one way of kind of setting right that narrative.
Sure. So basically just keep working at our own narrative. Yes. That's the only sort of answer, and hopefully even find money to fund such research studies, perhaps without a Western lens. And
absolutely.
Hi, good afternoon, Ms. Sarita. Thank you for your talk. So I'm a PhD researcher myself, and I'm in my last year. So I have two questions for you. In your last slide, you mentioned discard pre-identified coding mechanisms. Now, in my experience, when I have done a lot of interviews, and my research is a qualitative one, when you are continuously in the field, you are unconsciously coding as well, which might be influenced by those pre-identified codings or the theoretical framework that you have been already studying. So then how do you avoid that continuous coding that takes place in your head? And the second question is that since I am in my last year of my PhD, and now you know that number of publications, I need to get the publications out, you know, that sword is hanging over my head now. How do I not fall into that trap of, again, that you're talking about, polarization and certain narratives, and you need to write in a certain way to be accepted? Like, I'm a young researcher here. If I don't fall in the line, then how do I get published?
Okay, so your first question about unconscious coding that's happening in your head, the first thing to do for that is really have someone from a different discipline that you can have a conversation with. Or even if it is from, I'm sorry, did you say you're from humanities? Okay, so maybe you may want someone who is probably not from humanities, not to belittle humanities, but just that everybody has been caught in that same mindset. So you need someone who's probably not in that mindset. So maybe as a first step, talk to someone who's from a different discipline, because we are called the soft sciences, right? And the people who really hit us hard are the ones that we should keep them close to our heart, because these are the guys who are going to lead us in making our studies more credible. Right? So you probably need to have conversations about what you're doing, about the kind of data that's coming out, whether the hypothesis that you have formed in your head are credible hypotheses. Have a discussion at every stage. So that will make you start looking at your data from a different angle. And again, if you were to follow the inductive method of grounded theory approach, where you let the data itself build up the theories rather than you imposing the theory on it, I think that's another honest way of conducting your research, and also continue having this multidisciplinary dialogue with other people. And your second question was about papers. So I think enough and more papers these days, even in humanities, have come out which look at a non-Western paradigm. So for instance, I'll give you the example of this great book that I caught hold of the other day. It's called Western Foundations of Caste System by Martin Farek, Sufia Pathan, and others. They have co-edited it. And this is from Macmillan Press. So obviously this is quite mainstream. And they are talking about things from a non-European, non-Western kind of perspective. And they have built their theory really well. So if you can put your theory there and buttress it with cogent arguments, and not come across as an propaganda action oriented sort of propagandist sort of a person, well, why not? I'll give you an example. What's her name? Marianne Keppen speaks of saying that a lot of people have said that, but saying that the Indo-Aryans, there was no invasion that actually happened, right? The Aryan invasion theory itself is challenged by her. And she gives her so this is her standpoint, and she builds it up nicely with the fact that there are no anthropological evidence to point out that there's been an Aryan invasion, no historical evidence, no sociological evidence, right? And that all this really supports what she calls as the biblical narrative, that a set of people were looking to India as their promised land, and that they wanted to settle there. And this kind of bolsters the biblical narrative of, of a group of people, of any group of people belonging to either Noah or his sons. So it kind of goes like that. So she has picked it up, she has built it up with great cogent arguments, and why not? It will get published. So don't get heckled by that.
My question is, would phenomenological methods help in removing some of the biases, provided that the researchers know what phenomenological method is, and given the fact, accepting the fact that scientific research is inherently political in nature, so which affects your, way of thinking. So would these kind of methods help? The researchers have a lot of confusion what this method is, because it has philosophical undercurrents.
So the thing is, my answer is very simple. If you're looking at a phenomenon which is related to Indian culture or related to Indian, history, or anything that's Indian in nature, I'm just giving you an example. You need to see it from the Indic perspective. Whether you take it from a phenomenological point of view, a positivist point of view, of whatever point of view that you want to take up, just make sure that you are looking at it from a perspective that makes sense to understand the phenomenon. Just to give you a very simple example, if you look at a set of suppose your question, your research question is really to see how race has say impacted education, okay, and you only look at just the certain specific races in your country, assuming that you're a non-Westerner, because that's the kind of problems I have faced with often. And then you do that study in your own country, and you have certain biases. Obviously, the more studies you do, the more biases you will develop anyway, the more baggage you get, right? And then you use that hypothetical construct that becomes not just your assumption, it becomes more of a theoretical construct, and you want to get more corroboration for it. Now, I have a problem with that. Be any perspective, any specific philosophical orientation that you want to take, please go ahead and take it, but please align it to the Indic perspective if you're looking at an Indian phenomenon or an Indian incident that you're trying to understand.
I resonate very much with what Mr. Alok Tripathi had to say. I'm a science teacher, right? So and again, thanks to Sangam Talks as well, I got to know through a talk by Mr. C.K. Raju that there is no primary evidence for the Pythagorean theorem. That was a shock to me, quite frankly, that there is, and then I dug it up, and then I found that, turns out that there is, in fact, there might be some biblical connotations to what is going on in that part. And I also do resonate with what you say about, the purse strings actually decide the outcome of most researches. And I completely agree with that. Now, my question is basically about the way forward, in the sense that I see that the new national education policy talks about under point 17 of setting up of a research foundation, which will basically, I guess, I mean, it's very vague. I went through the points. It's not very, very, there's no, point by point, recommendations, but it gives you a basic general idea of, what they want to do. Now, my question is, ma'am, first of all, are you I guess, I mean, it's not a question, it's actually a suggestion. I mean, we would want people like you to be a part of that, first of all. The first thing. And second thing, I mean, what would be your recommendations in case, you know, when we, as a science teacher or as a math teacher, when I come across these kind of biases, like how do I go about, you know, and look, I mean, Pythagorean theorem is something that I was taught in, I think, 7th standard. Now, how do I, you know, nullify these? I mean, who knows if Euclid was wrong at the end of the day? You know, I mean, these are things that you take for granted. I mean, so how do I filter that out? So yeah, that's my question.
I think, I mean, I'm not very familiar. I probably just had just one interaction with Professor C.K. Raju. So I am not really familiar with the, you know, with what his perspectives are. But the way I see it is, if there is someone who is, you know, got you to start thinking along these lines, then I think you should probably meet more people from that, you know, from that field, because I think, if I'm not wrong, he's looking at the Indian perspective of mathematics, right? Am I right? So I think you probably need to have more discussions with, and mathematics is unfortunately not my field. So, but if I were to face a problem like I have faced often related to the humanities, then I would probably have more discussions with people who are from that perspective, and also from the opposite side. You know, get them to argue and you know, understand this is a dialogue. So the only way we, as at least I as an outsider who is not part of the math community, can make sense of it is if there are two people from different backgrounds sitting and having a common platform and an audience, and for us to take away from that, I mean, take home with that. And you're talking about the new educational policy. I think they, from what I understand, even I'm not very familiar with that, but I think they also had Western universities to come and set up shop. Was there something like that going on?
So in school, we are taught that we have to first create a theory and then we can go and interview someone on that and all of that. So if I don't have a topic or something to interview about, then how am I going to ask them questions or something like that? Means, how am I going to interview them and gather data if I don't have some topic or something to get it?
Okay. So I didn't say that you shouldn't have research questions. By all means, have research questions. You need to have research questions that are researchable on the field. Just don't have you know, constructs don't have assumptions which you want just corroboration for. That this is the way I have thought about it, and this is exactly how. There is like I mentioned from my example of the funded study, that yes, there is communal war, communal tension getting played out in this particular field. So I will go and ask questions whether or not you have had you know, animosity with that community and this community. If the answer is no, I will not take it. I will take only a yes for an answer. So those kinds of specific things is what I was cautioning people against. And it's perfectly okay to not have any hypothesis formed in the first place. By all means, you can do pilot studies. You can go to the field, talk to people, understand what are their, you know, what is their situation, what is their context. In fact, gathering as much as possible of information from the context, being part of the context is what is needed. You want to understand people as being one of them. You also want to understand people as not being one of them, but don't thrust it on them. In your case, what I'm going to say is go to the field with a set of research questions by all means, and understand what people are saying through open-ended questions. That will help you to go forward and how you want to take it forward from there. So the presence of non-Western researchers, for instance, and I can't you know, stress the point any more than this about the kind of problems it generates. One is where you try to put in, it brings out feelings of threat to the people, to the person you are interviewing in the village area. So when I myself and this colleague of mine who is not obviously an Indian, and then they asked us whether we had come to spread the gospel. Okay, so you have certain events, certain things like that which catch your eye, ear and catch your eye also. And then you start wondering what is going on in the back end. Who are these people who are coming in, you know, with their in the guise of studying in the field, and maybe they're also funded by various funding agencies. And this is just a front where they gather data for some study, very, very innocuous. But there's also something deeper that is happening at the background. And this anecdotal incident might just be funny, but it also tells you a lot of the rot that is happening at the back end in the guise of educational tours, educational studies. And it could, this is completely unacceptable.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, and then I thought that I will not. I'm a research scientist from US, and I have a medical background and done behavioral science. It is different, slightly different from social sciences. I see a trend of, ethical committee involvement. I don't know how it is, how the scenario is back in India about, having every proposal being reviewed and approved before people go out into the field to collect the data. So I wanted to get a sense of what the situation, what the background is as far as the ethical committee approval in the social sciences studies.
The ethical committee itself is most unethical. So I really don't know what sort of ethics they will guide us to, which is where all the rot how the rot has spread. And it's not just India. Like the example I gave to one of our participants today about how theory building happens in the corridors of academic institute in the United States, very well-known institutes in the United States, how a certain set of unethical studies get to happen, and they come up with their own theoretical constructs, and they get passed. The ethical committee, ideally there should be one that is again multidisciplinary in nature, which is not looking at it just from a certain background or from certain set of antecedents, but they should be able to gauge the ethical impact of a certain question or a field immersion by discussing it amongst themselves. And they should not all be like-minded, because everybody will say, hey, this is good to go, let it go, this is fine. So that's not happening either here. I'm pretty sure, it's all that effective even in the humanities departments in the United States.